Hi guys, time for another book review. This time I'm going to be reading Cinder and Ella by Melissa Lemon. Ooh. I want to first start off by talking about how I kind of found this book and why I chose to read it. So, first year that we were doing the book club, Halloween was coming around and I was trying to come up with ideas for books we could read. I had this different types of genre books, and one of the genres was a mashup genre, which was inspired by Pride, Prejudice, and Zombies, Abraham Lincoln Vampire Hunter, books like that. So I was trying to come up with books that fall under that sort of category. And there are a lot of copies of those two types of books, or, Jane Eyre Vampire Hunter and Little Vampires, Women, and all that. And then I stumbled across this book called Cinder and Ella. And I thought it was a really interesting idea, interesting plot, from what the synopsis said. And, of course, movie mashup. Mashups wasn't the genre that won. It was, movies that were based off books. So, yeah. So that's why, like, last year I had it set up that was going to be the vote, was movie mashups, because it's the one I had the most interest in and had the biggest variety. And this one lost again to Confessions of an Ugly Stepsister. Yeah. So I decided to read this one on my own, and to start off with, I'm just going to read two little parts from this. First is the synopsis of what the book was, based on what they say. When their father mysteriously disappeared, sisters Cinder and Ella struggle to care for their two spoiled sisters and a mother who barely knew them. As Cinder submits to the abuse, Ella vows not to give in or to give up on her beloved father. The quest to find her father will demand everything, her strength, her tenacity, and even her heart. Now it's up to Ella to save her family, her father, herself, and the entire kingdom. Yeah, this plot, that's not the plot. Her father is a character, he does go missing, but the majority of the story takes place a year after he's been missing. They neither Cinder nor Ella go out looking for their father. They do run into him at a certain point, but that's not, yeah, that synopsis doesn't cover the story at all. And then we get to the first part of the book, with the prologue. So, if you drink water and breathe air, you've heard the story of Cinderella. And if you drink water and breathe air, you have heard the story wrong. There was no fairy godmother, no glass slippers. No wicked stepmother, no wicked stepsisters. And my brain at this line was going, uh-oh, not again. Because, you know what other book sounded a lot like that in the beginning? Confessions of an Ugly Stepsister. And we all know that I did not particularly love that one. And it goes on to say, like, there wasn't even a prince, or at least not one you're expecting, not one in the way you might think. And if you're expecting everyone to live happily ever after, you may wind up being disappointed. Yeah, that's a really great way to start off a Cinderella adaptation. So, I'm gonna start off by saying that this really isn't a Cinderella adaptation. It says it is, but honestly, if you change the main characters' names from Cinder and Ella, you wouldn't be able to tell that this was a Cinderella story at all, because it's so far removed. So the plot of the story is, on a dark, stormy night, the prince visits this blacksmith, his wife, and their 4 daughters. Now, the 4 daughters are up in the bed, asleep, except for Ella, who is watching all this from the window. Anyway, so the prince goes to the blacksmith and says, "I have very many worries about our kingdom. There's clearly something's going on. There are things that I don't particularly like, and I'm looking for support." And the prince is described as this person having a silvery tongue that he can say anything and people will believe him. So the prince leaves, And you see a dramatic change in the father. He goes from being this lighthearted, warm person to very cold and up. And eventually just disappears one day. And a year later is when the rest of the story takes place. The wife, aka Cinder and Ella's mom, has basically become comatose. All she does is sit in front of her spindle wheels making yarn. She won't acknowledge most people talking to her, with the exception of the eldest sister, Katrina. Now, the eldest sister, Katrina, is spoiled, gets what she wants. Basically, she asks for something, she gets it, especially with the mother, and doesn't care anything about the rest of her family. We then have the second oldest sister, Cinder, who is named so because when she was born, her hair was the color of cinders, which I assume would be kind of an ashy color. Ashy and a little bit red, maybe. She is described as being the nicest person on the planet. She does anything she's asked with a smile. She's constantly taking care of everyone else in the family. Next up is Ella, the second youngest. She's the one described most like her father. She doesn't have her mother's facial features. She's more boyish, you would say. But she has a very strong spirit, very can-do attitude, and cannot stand her family at all. Youngest sister is named Beatrice. She is at that point where she can no longer really be considered a child, but is not really an adult, not even really a teenager. So like that little age right between kid and preteen, where you're just like, they can still act like a brat, but not for much longer. And basically, Beatrice is using that for as long as she can, because she's spoiled from being treated as the baby of the family. So she's constantly screaming, constantly demanding things, throwing things, breaking things, biting people, pulling hair, things of that nature. So Cinder goes into town one day, and Ella goes along with her because the mother is always asking them to do things together. It's like Katerina wants new shoes, so the mother says, Cinder and Ella, go to the town and get your sister new shoes. So it's clear that she's going to start calling them Cinderella after a certain point, that she's just going to fuse that. So they go into town, and Cinder goes and talks to some of the people that work at the castle, and finds out that they actually have an opening, and she interviews for it and gets a job working in the castle, which means she's going to get food, money, a place to stay for 6 nights out of the week, and will be taught how to read and write. And she desperately wants to do this. She wants to go and be smart, do better and be more than she is. But she doesn't want to leave the family to take care of themselves because they're bad at it. So she asked Ella if she would do this, if she'd stay and take care of the family. And Ella reluctantly agrees to this, but she doesn't promise. She says, I will stay. I will help as long as I can. Next morning, Cinder's gone off to the castle, starting work. Ella comes down the stairs, and she says hello to Mother. Mother's like basically goes, Cinderella, get your ass down here! Type thing. And so basically, instead of doing the slow fade, which is what I was thinking, it's just instantly, no more Cinder and, just Cinderella. Cinderella, Cinderella. Does not acknowledge that Ella exists, and this shakes Ella to her core, basically, because, her mother doesn't even acknowledge she exists. She takes off to the woods and goes to her father's tree. Now, in this world, there's basically a myth, a story of that every time a person is born, a tree grows as well, and that a human soul is connected to that tree. As long as that tree is standing, the person is alive. When the tree dies, the person dies. So she goes to her father's tree, and that's why she believes her father's still alive, because the tree is still there, mostly alive. It's lost all its leaves, and it's starting to die slow, but it's still around. And Ella comes to the decision that she's never going back home. She ends up getting picked up by this man in a cart who is the royal bridge builder. His name is Mr. Robinson. basically takes her to his town of Riverside, where they meet his wife, Fern. And basically it's like, oh, we need someone to help raise our kids, to teach them things and this, and, play with them. And, Fern could use a hand. And Ella agrees to this, weirdly enough, considering she didn't want to take care of her own family, but she has no problem taking care of somebody else's family. It helps that the two kids are very nice, respectable kids, and not a little brat like Beatrice is. She agrees to work for them. She's getting food and board, and also being taught how to read and write. Meanwhile, Cinderella comes home after her first week of work, has spent the entire week worried and distraught because she's worried about what's going on at home, what's going on with her family. Gets home, finds the house in chaos. It's like Katerina spent all the money on food, on shoes and clothing. Beatrice has messed up every part of the house, broken lots of plates, caused lots of damage. Mom's still just sitting at the wheel, ignoring everything. And she's asking people, where's Ella? What happened to Ella? And the mom doesn't acknowledge. None of them really acknowledge that Ella ever existed. So, so Cinder is now distraught. She thinks her sister is missing or dead, and goes back to the castle and spends every night crying in her bed. One of the knights walking the hall hears her doing this every night, and his name is Knight Tanner. Now, Tanner is a strong, proud, noble knight who's like, I want to help this maiden with her sadness, and he asks her why, and then she doesn't really talk to him. She just kind of walks off, and he ends up talking to a bunch of people, and it's like, oh, her sister's missing, that's why. And Tanner goes to the head knight, he's like, I would like some time leave so I can go search for this missing girl, because this servant is very distraught and is not doing good work, and I want to help out and at least give her some peace of mind. The head knight's like, alright, I do have to run this by the royal family and see what they say. Ends up telling the prince. The prince calls on Tanner. He's like, I will agree to your journey, but I will be sending two of my special warriors along with you. Their names are William and Flesher. Yeah. And when the prince, who already has this kind of dark tone to him, and he's kind of coming off very evil, has a crony named Flesher, and that's all we know him by. It's like, is that a nickname? Do you get that from removing people's flesh? No, it's just a name. But it is one of those things with this book where they do, like, mostly normal names, and then you have odd names like Cinder and Fern, and then Flesher. And weirdly, Flesher is the good one of these two. William, the other knight, is a drunk, toll rapist. Yeah. So, the king basically tells him, you have 2 months to find this girl, and then you must return. So, after a month and a half of looking for her, they finally end up in Riverside, and they find a girl with a description, and they go talk to Ella, and they're like, your sister's very worried about you, we'd like to take you home. And I was like, I tell my sister I'm where I am and that I'm fine and happy, but I don't want to go home. I'm not going back. To which Flesher and William say, we have orders from the king to take you back to the castle. He's like, you can either choose to come willingly, or we are ordered to take you forcefully. So, Ella begrudgingly agrees to go with them, and basically keeps having these moments with Tanner where he's like helping her up onto his horse, or helping her down, and just ends up causing her to fall, and this and that, and this develops a relationship between them where they just go laugh at his inability to be a smooth, charming knight. Love. So, one of the nights, they go off, they stop for the night, they leave William alone with Ella while they go get firewood and food. And basically, William is 3 sheets to the wind, drunk off his ass and climbs on top of Ella to do what a drunk person climbing on top of a woman would try to do. And luckily, you know, Tanner and Fletcher show up at the right moment, but this really cements for Tanner that these are not the people that he should be with. These are not, something very wrong is going on, and he needs to go find out what. So he wakes up early in the morning, wakes up Ella, and they take off, and he drops Ella off at her family home while he goes to the castle to find out what's going on. He goes to the castle, he ends up going to the head knight saying, hey, I found the girl, the prince sent these two guys and said he had to take them in. Can you see what's going on with this and that? The head knight sells Tanner out to the prince. The prince has him in prison until he tells him where the sister is. Tanner refuses. So the prince at this point has been spending a lot of time with Cinder, who he's promoted from being a generic servant to the head servant. And he basically just asks her, oh, where do you live? Because I'd like to bring your sister to you if she's still alive. And she's like, oh, yeah, we live here on this hill. So he sends William and Fletcher to go get her. Thankfully, Ella, at this point, has left the house. She's heading towards the castle. She dresses up as a boy to get through the castle gates, and gets down into, goes and talks to her sister, and she's like, I need your help, Cinder. The prince has taken this man that I love, Knight Tanner, and she's in prison, and you need to help us. There's something wrong with the prince. And Cinder's like, what are you talking about? The prince is amazing. You are lying. You are clearly and basically says all these mean things to her sister, like, you're selfish, blah, blah, blah. So Ella steals Cinder's key without her knowing, and goes down into the cells and talks to to Tanner, and Tanner's like, she's like, we need to know what's going on with the prince. We need to find out what it is and try to stop him so we can see why in the world he's doing all this just to us. And Tanner's like, well, he does have this room this tower above his room that nobody can get into. He's the only one that has a key. And Ella dresses up as a knight, sneaks up into the prince's room, finds the key, unlocks the door, and finds this room full of people, basically all in the cradle, the legs up cradle position thing. And one of the people in there is her father. And she's, like, shaking him, trying to get him to look at her, and she does not. And the prince pops up, and he's like, I see you found my little secret. She's like, what did you do to my father? What is going on? This and that. And the prince is like, I haven't done anything to him. I merely talked to him. It's like, you're holding him against his will. It's like, no, he's not. He's not chained up. This door only locks from the other side. He can leave anytime he wants. He chooses to stay. Well, why does he do that? I don't know. It's his choice. And there's nothing you can do about it. And basically the prince turns and starts to leave. And Ella pulls out a kitchen knife that she'd taken from her house and runs at the prince and stabs him in the chest. And he just looks down at it and goes, and pulls it out. She stabs him again and then takes off, because she doesn't understand what's going on. And he then takes off running. The prince removes the knife, tells the guards to arrest Cinder, throw her into prison. Ella manages to make it down into the prison, talks to Tanner, and Cinder tells him that if the father's up there and he's being held against his will, and the prince, I stabbed the prince, he didn't die, I don't know what's going on. And Cinder tells her, you need to talk to the king and queen. They are the nicer people. They are the kindest people in the kingdom. They can help you with this. So Ella sneaks up into the king and queen's room, and he tells them what's going on, and they're like, yeah, we kind of know about that. There's nothing we can actually do about it. She's like, but they're holding, he's holding my sister and my love interest in the prison, and my father hostage. And it's like, there's nothing I can really do. His power's too strong, and this and that. But it's like, there is one thing that we can tell you that would help you. It's like, do you know the story of the trees? And she's like, yeah, I knew. My father has told me it. It's like, well, there's your answer. So Ella basically figures out, I have to find the prince's tree. If I find the prince's tree, I can destroy that, and that'll weaken or kill the prince. So she goes down, steals Tanner's horse, takes off into the night. The horse, of course, immediately abandons Ella as soon as she lets go of it. It's gone. It never comes back. And the prince, meanwhile, has talked to Cinder, has her back under his silvery tongue control, now sends her out with William and Flesher to go find Ella. Cinder managed to stumble upon Ella, and is like, while she's alone, she tells her sister, like, what are you doing? You need to come back to the castle. This is not gonna work. This, you need to trust the prince. And it's like, no, the prince is evil. It's like, no, he's not. How dare you say that? Ella's like, you're with William and Flesher right now, yes? I would stick closer to Flesher. Just forewarning. And takes off. And even though part of Cinder really wants to go immediately tell the prince what's going on, she doesn't. She keeps it to herself. Meanwhile, Tanner has managed to convince some of the fellow knights who are all starting to be a little wary of the prince to let him go. He escapes and goes chasing after Ella to help save her. Ella travels all the way to basically the Twin Pine Forest, the Lost Enchanted Forest. Basically, is heading towards the grove of all the trees are, and all of the trees are, like, decayed or rotten or starting to just be warped, and then she comes across this tree in the center of a field that's even more dark and menacing and just malicious looking tree. It's evil. So, as soon as she arrives, the prince is like right behind her and is there, and he's like, he's like, you're here to destroy my tree, aren't you? She's like, yes. He's like, okay. And he throws an axe down. It's like, go ahead. And then turns and leaves. And she's chopping at the tree, and the tree is not getting a dent on it, and the axe breaks. And then a forest fire starts, and, like, luckily Tanner finds her at the last second, but she's very sick and nearly dying at this point. So Tanner rushes her back to the town, and the town tells him, oh, there's a healer on this side of the mountain that is the only person who could possibly help her. Rushes Ella to this person, and he's like, she's fine. It's her tree that's the problem. There's something wrong with her tree. You need to find it and stop whatever is causing the trouble. So Tanner takes off again, heading toward, and heads to the royal orchards. And finds her tree momentarily, and it's just covered in these black vines that are slowly crushing it, which are the same vines that were all on all the dead, dying trees in the forest around the princess. And Tanner's just cutting up the vines, trying desperately to dig them out, and every time he's cutting some, more grow, and it's just become this fruitless effort, and the prince just shows up and is like, you can try all night if you want. You're not going to succeed. You're not going to win. And then turns and leaves again. And basically, I'm going to stop right at this point, because this is the last 10 pages of this book are very, very weird and insane, and I don't want to spoil this right now. I'm going to talk about it after I give my thoughts and opinions on the series as a whole. Or the book as a whole, anyway. So, yeah, this one is, like I said, this one is so far removed from Cinderella that it doesn't really feel like Cinderella. Which is fine, because it does something that was sorely missing in Confessions of an Ugly Stepsister, which is this one feels like a fairy tale. It feels grandiose and big and has this good elements to it, and you have this really good villain in the prince. Kind of. He's a little too overpowered throughout the entire thing, and it doesn't... And because at the point where I just stopped for y'all, he seems unbeatable. He is basically undefeatable. He's basically the devil. Like, I've talked a little bit about, like, why I have a problem with Confessions of an Ugly Stepsister. I don't have a problem with the story. And I don't have a problem with the adaptation. I don't have a problem with the idea. It's a good idea. For me, there are 3 things I have a problem with. 1, I don't particularly like the way it was written. It was very slow, very monotonous. And when it's following Cinderella that closely, it doesn't. It just, like, it's, why do I need to keep reading? I know what's coming. I know what's happening. Second was the tone. It was too realistic. It was trying so hard to ground itself in reality that it was depressing. Because it's really, you don't want to read a story where it's like, it doesn't matter what happens in the story. It's like, in the end, the 5 pages after the end of the story, this person died due to some disease. She was 23. Yeah, that was Confessions of an Ugly Stepsister, and it's like, so the entire story is just slow and methodical and has no life or energy to it, which is why I had a time to with it. It's also why when they would talk about art in that book, I got interested, because that was the only part that they talked about with any energy or any passion. It's what you want in a story, is you want to give a fudge about what's going on. And that one didn't do that. This one actually did that. It did a very good job of that. I really cared about Ella. I really cared about Cinder. I cared about Tanner, who's an interesting character in its own right. But there are some choices in this that are super weird, and it's just like, why did you do that? What was the point of this and that? And there's like this one thing that Tanner does twice in the book that really drove me kind of nuts. So he's trying to befriend Ella, and when they're first taking her back, and he's like, it's like, you must be hungry. What type of meat you want? You say anything, and I will find it for you, and I will bring you that meat. And she's like, deer. Basically, wants venison. And he's like, okay. And he goes and kills a deer and brings it and carries it on over his shoulders to her. This happened right before the rape scene. So, that's fine. See, I don't have a problem with that. It makes perfect sense in the story-wise in that. The problem is when they separate and go their own way, they stop again for a night, and he goes and kills another deer for the 2 of them. 2 people sharing one giant deer. What a waste of meat. It's like, because if you're someone who's ever read a survival book or seen a survival story, you know that a deer is lots and lots of meat, and you clearly don't have a tanning thing, you don't have any way to make jerky, so basically it's such a waste in the story. You're killing an entire deer for 2 people who could be perfectly full up on rabbit or a bird. You know, it doesn't, to me it's that thing of going, I know it's a fairy tale and killing the deer is this and that, but it's just a little too much. It's just ridiculous in my brain. That said, I'm like, I like some of the stuff they did. There's this, like, Cinder and Ella are both interesting characters. They're both unique to themselves. I do like Tanner. The prince is a good villain, even if he's overpowered. The fact that he is overpowered actually makes him a little bit better villain, because he literally looks at everyone and everything as a pawn, and doesn't have to do anything to worry about them. So it was like him just going up to Ella and being like, heh heh, I won, and walks away, and that she literally can't do anything to stop him, is actually really good. Problem is, when you make a villain like that, defeating them becomes really tricky in a way that's believable. Like, overall, like, if I counted this story up to the end, it would be 4.5 out of 5 for me. It's very solid. It's got good characters, good writing, good story. Everyone is interesting. The locations I love the way it flows. The fact that it feels like it's a fairy tale helps it. But with the ending, the ending drags it down a bit. And I talked about this a little bit with the Bartimaeus trilogy, where it's like the ending with that dragged that one down too. But that was a foreseeable ending. That was an ending that could happen. It was just the slightly more depressing ending that you could get. This ending is way more out there and way more confusing. And I'm going to talk about that right now. So if you have any interest in this book, and this is something you want, or thinking about reading, this sounds somewhat interesting to you, I recommend stopping the video now, because this next part might change your mind. And I would rather you read it because it is interesting, it is unique in its own way. But, so we get to the ending. So the prince has just left Tanner in the orchard trying to remove all these weeds and not having any chance whatsoever. So the king comes down and talks to the prince. And the king's like, so I've been hearing about the things you've been doing. And this little girl stood up to you, so as of right now, you are banished from the kingdom. And the prince is like, excuse me, do you know who I am? Do you know the power that I hold? And the king's like, do you know the power I hold? You know the story. You know that my tree is the strongest tree in all the kingdom. So, you are banished, and you are to never return. And the prince is like, well, what makes you think I'm not just going to come back here with an army and take you down? And he's like, you're welcome to try. But I don't think you'll find too many people willing to follow you. And the prince just turns and leaves. And Tanner spends the whole night digging up the roots with the help of other knights and everyone around him. And they manage to save Ella. Tanner runs back to her and proposes. And they get married. And Cinder ends up developing a relationship with Flesher. Because he complimented her hair, which she had never heard someone liking her hair color before. Okay. And they both basically go up and visit their father, who is still in this comatose state and unmoving. And they're like, is there any way we can save him? And it's like, I don't know. Maybe. Okay, is there any way we can bring Mom back to the living world? Just keep her from just sitting in front of that spindle wheel all of her time. I don't know. And they go talk to the king, and they're like, king, you had the power to banish the prince, and you knew he was evil, and you knew he was doing these things. Well, why didn't you do that beforehand? It's like, because he's my son. Yeah, and he was clearly trying to overthrow you. That was a plot point for a large part of this. And then I started looking at this, and I'm going, is this a freaking God analogy? Is the prince the devil? Because he was pretty much the devil. He's pretty much evil incarnate. And now the king is God. Is this some weird religion story? Because they're talking about how love overcame the darkness, and that once love is introduced, the prince will lose power, because every time a follower leaves him, he will become weaker and weaker. And I'm just like, did I just freaking read a Bible story? I actually had to look up, like, this author, because this sounded like something that someone's hyper-religious would do, and I had to check to see if she was, like, Mormon or something. And I didn't see anything that said this was specifically a Bible story, or this was a religion-related story, but it was still, like, yeah, it was pretty much, like, this book falls under the definition of a Deus Ex Machina. And for those of you who don't know what a Deus Ex Machina means, it's something that comes from ancient Greek theater. In ancient Greek theater, they had a bunch of times where they would end up writing themselves into a corner. But in Greek theater, they believed in gods, and they believed that gods could come down and interact, so what they would do is they would use this is they would just have Zeus come down from Mount Olympus. And they would use a specific machine that was called the God Machine, or the Deus Ex Machina. And in modern days, that's any time where the ending or something comes completely out of left field. It's never been mentioned, never been set up. It's just randomly the thing that stops what's happening. And there are a couple movies that use this, but we honestly, as people, we've gotten a lot better at preventing that. But there's still a bunch of books and movies and stuff that end with something it's like, how are we gonna stop this evil killer robot? Oh, I have this gun. It was designed to kill it. Okay. Did we establish the gun early in the story? Nope. All right then. It happens. It's sadly a thing of where you write yourself into a corner. You have to do something, and sometimes you do something cheap and stupid. This one, however, it's like I understand that she might have written herself into a corner, and the banishing thing. Yeah, the banishing thing was really weird, and the fact that it's all somewhat God-related, it's just, or seems God-related, it's just, maybe I'm reading too much into it, but just kind of wrecks the whole story. So what ends up happening is, like, Ella and Tanner go back to the house, back to her mom's house. They take Beatrice with them, and go and raise Beatrice as their own child. Cinder and Tanner are joined by the older sister Katerina, who loves the castle life, and the mom is just kind of left alone at her spindle, and that's sort of how it ends. So it's like this weird, not happy ending. Which, granted, the book warned me. If you're thinking this is gonna have a happily ever after, you might be surprised. I'm like, yeah, I could definitely say this ending surprised me. But it was such a weird ending, like, everyone gets happy ending except the parents? One of whom doesn't do anything to warrant having an unhappy ending? Yeah. So that kind of tanks the book a bit for me. It's still a good book. I still liked it. I still enjoyed it. But, like I said, it was a 4.45 for me before, and it just kind of dragged it down to just... let me put it this way. Confessions of an Ugly Stepsister is right here. And this is Cinder and Ella. This is not an adaptation, but if I looked at it as just its own book, with the exception of that ending, it's a really good book. Just that ending is super rough and lowers it drastically. Yeah. It's like I've read, this is my third adaptation book-wise of the Cinderella story. It's definitely in the middle. It's like the bottom one is Confessions of an Ugly Stepsister. The second one is Cinder and Ella. And the third one, I don't want to give away, because the fact that it turns out to be Cinderella is the best part of the book. But I can definitely say that I was enchanted to read it. That's all for today. Later, guys.